Good evening, and thank you for coming. I'd like to start by introducing myself. My name is Sharb El-Aoun, and I'm the president of the McGill Alumni Association in Lebanon. I would like to welcome you all here and extend a special thanks to our generous sponsors and host for this evening, Bank Audi, well represented by His Excellency, Chairman of the Board, Mr. Remo Audi, and by a number of employees and top management with many familiar faces from the alumni. I'd like to mention in specific Mr. Ramzi Abu Azzuddin, Mr. Antoine Maouchi, and Mrs. Hazmik Khouri, with whom we've coordinated this event. The lecture series gives graduates and friends of McGill the opportunity to hear what's happening on the cutting edge of knowledge in areas ranging from space exploration to the psychology of magic. We like to think of it as a lifelong learning at its best. It is my pleasure to see so many of you here for this edition of McGill on the Move with international business expert, Professor Omar Toulan. We're going to focus tonight on how globalization has transformed our world. Before I turn over to our distinguished speaker, the floor, I would like to give you a quick update from McGill. This year has been full of awards, accomplishments, and discoveries. And I would like to share just a few of these. This year marked the 190th anniversary of McGill's founding. McGill, as usual, was ranked for the 8th consecutive year as one of the top 25 universities worldwide by QS ranking. Ambitious fundraising campaign has proved great success to date, with over 80,000 individual donations so far, representing 108 countries. Researchers at McGill are leading the way with development of a blood test that could one day detect breast cancer at a very early stage and might even render mammography screening obsolete. McGill scientists are also working on a blood test for Alzheimer's and the development of a pill which could erase painful memories. And what would news from McGill or Montreal be without the mention of hockey? In March of this year, the McGill Redmen took the national title in university men's hockey for the first time in their 135 years of history. It was a nail-biting game with victory claimed in the last moments of overtime. Our speaker this evening joins us from the internationally renowned Des Hôtels Faculty of Management at McGill, where he teaches on the MBA, Executive MBA, MBA Japan, and BCom programs. Before coming to McGill, Professor Toulan worked as a management consultant in New York and Washington, D.C., and as a researcher on the United States President's Council of Economic Advisors. His interests range from impact of environmental shocks on businesses to the effect of market liberalization on the behavior of firms in emerging markets. Tonight, Professor Toulan will speak on the topic of offshoring and what globalization means today, which will be followed by a question and answer period. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Professor Omar Toulan.
First of all, thank you very much, Charbel, for that very nice introduction, and thank you very much to our hosts here at Audi for hosting our event tonight. It's a pleasure to be here with you. It's always great to be able to come and talk to alumni and friends of McGill. I'm going to try to be as entertaining as the psychology of magic, though I'm not sure if I'll be able to succeed, but I will be talking today about really three issues. The first one is, as Charbel mentioned, globalization. And really, where are we today in terms of globalization? Just how global are we? Are we as global as we think?
So first I'm going to talk about really where we are with regards to globalization. Secondly, with regards to a research topic I'm looking at, which is offshoring. And how does offshoring relate to the globalization phenomena? And in specific, if we have time at the end, I'll talk a little bit about the case I'm actually looking at, which is the firm I used to work for, which was McKinsey & Company, their knowledge center, which has been offshored to India. We'll talk a little bit about MCKC and how it's actually changing the overall firm and how it operates on a worldwide basis, not just its operations in India. And I would like to ask, though, if you have any questions along the way, this is probably just the way I'm used to it, feel free to ask along as we go, rather than just holding them towards the end. I'll also have a few questions for you as we go, so you can start thinking about your responses. So let me get us started. So globalization, what does it really mean? Just to give you a little bit of a background, if you go 20 years ago, back to 1990, the US Library of Congress, they collect basically every book that's published in basically the United States and most books around the world. Back in 1990, there were 50 books published that year in the United States with the word globalization in the title. Okay, anybody know how many there are published basically today? Okay, so we've gone from 50 to 1,000 in the course of 20 years, and I think it is reflective of the emphasis or the attention being dedicated to the issue of globalization. Now, with 1,000 books being published every year with the title globalization, you can imagine that there isn't one common definition as to what that actually is, right? There are, I think, a number of traits, though, which describe globalization. I just want to go through a couple of them. The first one, let me just move the chair here. Obviously, reduce trade and investment barriers. I think this is sort of where we start when we think about globalization, right? That we're reducing barriers to trade, to investment across countries. And this is something which, if you think about globalization, you know, there are some people who say this is a relatively new phenomenon, last 30, 40 years. You know, ever since post-World War II, the introduction of GATT, followed by the WTO, the United Nations, and so forth. But the reality is, if you look at the history of globalization, you go back to the late 1800s, and the late 1800s were much more global than the early 1900s. Right? If you compared 1880 to 1930, okay, you would find that there was more global integration in 1880, partly because of simply the way the world was structured. Okay? With empires, there was, to some extent, an easier form of globalization because you were trading within empires as opposed to across national boundaries. And also when the economies are better, as we see today, there is more of a tendency towards globalization. When things get a bit harder, as they did in the 1930s, there is a tendency away from globalization towards more protectionism. So one thing we should remember is globalization is not, at least from my point of view, a linear process. Right? It is not a straight line constantly going uphill. That being said, it is, I think, a linear trend in the sense that it might be going in a wave, but that wave is gradually going upwards. Right? So these factors, while they may go up and down, ebb and so forth over time, there is a tendency, I think, towards greater levels of globalization, towards greater levels of integration, even if you just look for the past 100 years. But again, I'll get to a little bit finer definition of that in a moment. Greater mobility of resources, obviously human, technological, right? People, just the fact that you know, many of the people in this room went to school in Canada and have come back. The mobility which is present today obviously is much greater than it was in the past, and this is something which I think is linearly increasing. Better access to faster transmission of information. This is, you know, when people refer to the internet as the driving force behind globalization. I think sometimes it gets overhyped to some extent, as we'll see in some of the figures. Most websites are not global. Most retailers on the web are not global. They don't have the capabilities to sell to you anywhere in the world. They can't provide services to you anywhere in the world. They are still local, okay, to a large extent. However, it does, the fact that you can compare prices across the globe much easierly today than in the past does result in a let's say, a condensing of information and basically opening up of sort of information channels which previously were much more difficult to access. Greater exposure to foreign ideas, customs, approaches. Right? I was just arrived last night, was walking around in Hamra Street this morning. Obviously, lots of foreign shops, foreign retailers. But it's not just the brands that we see that are crossing globes or crossing markets. I was in Berlin a few weeks ago, and I was talking to a friend who works for a company which basically all they do is they scan the globe for internet ideas which they think have strong potential but are underdeveloped in that one market, take that idea and leverage it in different markets. Okay? They have the financing, they have the technical resources to do it, and they basically are scanning the globe for ideas and then trying to leverage them where there's actually more potential. Okay? So this idea of spreading of ideas, customs, I think is a trademark feature of an increased global world. And obviously, all of these previous aspects do result in greater integration, greater interdependence between countries. What happens in one country is going to have an impact on another, much faster today than it did in the past. You think about contagion effects, right? If you look at the speed at which the 2008 crisis in the financial markets spread compared to previous financial market crises, it was much faster. And part of that is the greater interdependence between the markets, the greater linkages across the countries, across the banking systems and the investors. Again, I'll show us a few numbers relating to that later. So there are definitely pros, as I'll talk about, but there are definitely as well risks associated with being more interdependent across countries. And the last issue, which is, and this is going to be my first question, standardization. I put a question mark here, because I think it is debatable. Do you think we have more standardization today as a result of globalization or less? You can argue this either way. What do you think? More, right? Referring to all the brands that I was talking about earlier, we see Starbucks in every country, we see Zara in every country. Okay. Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. I mean, this is really the customization versus standardization debate is pretty much the fundamental debate within international business. How much do you tailor versus how much do you force standardization to achieve economies of scale and so forth? Yes, so even if you take a Starbucks or you take a McDonald's and so forth, there will be certain levels of customization. Okay. But even if we say, in general, these are globalized, standardized products. The Big Mac, for the most part, is pretty similar country to country, right? But you can still also make an argument that while there might be more standardization, there's also more variety. Okay? Think about this. With trade, with cross-border investments, what do you get? You get possibly a smaller overall pool of players, okay? But that pool of players is operating in more markets. I'll give you an extreme example. Let's say 50 years ago, okay, essentially in most markets you had probably 1, 2, maybe 3 companies producing cars, right? So if you were in Italy 50 years ago, you pretty much were buying a Fiat. If you were in France, a Renault or a Peugeot. In the US, it was Chrysler, Ford, or GM, okay? Now today, we might not have 50 or 60 international car companies, but maybe we're down to really 15 core large companies. But those 15 will be present in most of the main markets. So as a consumer, as an individual, there's actually more variety than there was possibly 15 years ago, okay, 20, 25 years ago. But they are more standardized across countries. Okay, so from a consumer point of view, I think there is more variety. But from an overall global point of view, yes, I do believe there is more standardization going on. So it's a little bit of a two-sided coin there. Okay? From a consumer point of view, I think we are to some extent better off. Question is, are we losing more of the sort of national attributes to our products, to our services, and so forth? Okay, but again, I'm going to show us some numbers which might challenge even that basic idea that we're going completely towards standardized products. Okay? Any questions, thoughts so far? Please just jump in. Okay. Obviously, some opportunities with globalization. Why is so much written on globalization? What is the benefit towards us? Well, obviously, tapping into new markets, virgin markets, arbitraging factor markets and sourcing. This is what I'm going to be talking about in a few moments with regards to offshoring. Offshoring is essentially an arbitrage, right? You're arbitraging the fact that either labor costs are lower in another market, that they have better infrastructure, that they have better talent, okay, and leveraging that to then service your home market needs. Okay? Learning from foreign markets. I think oftentimes this gets underrated as a rationale for going abroad. you do see a lot of foreign investment purely for learning techniques or learning rationales. Think about a lot of the acquisitions of Chinese companies into North America, into Europe, and so forth. Sometimes it's to gain access to resources, okay? And other times it's to gain access to technologies, to brands. The acquisition of by Lenovo of IBM personal computers was definitely a way of getting into the market, but also accessing certain technologies. So cross-border investments, foreign investments with the goal of learning from foreign markets are just as important as going to foreign markets simply to sell what you've done at home. Okay? Leveraging your home country image. Okay? A lot of countries take advantage of this in the global arena, right? What would be an example of countries leveraging their image, taking advantage of globalization by leveraging their image abroad? Okay? But even if you just think whether it's Swiss watches, whether it's French wine, whether it's German engineering, okay? Countries have images which, with a more globalized marketplace, you are able to tap more into, right? Diversifying your business cycles, okay? Now, we have to be careful because this, to some extent, with globalization, is also becoming more harmonized, right? As I said before, contagion effect is to some extent reducing the ability to leverage different business cycles because more economies are actually in sync with regards to business cycles because of the interdependence they have, right? Now, there are some extreme cases where, say you are taking advantage of seasonal differences. You know, with globalization, we can do a lot of things, but we're not going to change the fact that when it's winter in the north, it's summer in the south, right? And if you don't sell everything you have in the northern hemisphere in the summer season, you can send it to the south and vice versa. Or you take advantage of the fact that you have, when it's season for harvesting grapes in Chile, okay, and there's a plethora of grapes, which means they're cheap in Chile. It's winter in the northern hemisphere, and as a result, there's a dearth of grapes, and you can basically trade to take advantage of climatic differences as well. Okay? It's sort of an alternate form of business cycle diversification, but it basically gives you the same effect. Allows you to leverage differences across these markets. Targeting global niches. Okay? This is something where I think the internet has helped quite a bit. Right? You know, what could we not have done in the past? In the past, certain markets were simply too small to sustain certain industries. Whether you're a provider of a certain subcomponent to an industry or something which is you're just coming from a small country which doesn't have a large enough base to allow you to basically develop as an industry, basically they just didn't develop in the past. So oftentimes what happened? Firms would have to do it themselves. They would have to produce these subcomponents because there weren't enough clients for any supplier to basically get involved to do it themselves. Okay? Now, with more of a global outlook, you can actually identify customer bases all over the world, and as a result, possibly get the economies of scale to have enough customers to actually get that nascent supplier industry started. Okay? And finally, servicing global clients. Okay, and this is, I think, a challenge, obviously, which the banking industry faces, which anybody who services a global customers face. It's the pro of globalization. Now you can service, hopefully, customers in more markets. But at the same time, when your customers start going abroad, you have to make sure that you can actually follow them and provide the same services. If you can't, what's going to happen? They're going to find somebody who can. Right? So this is the whole area of what we call global account management. Okay, where you need to be able to mimic their global structure in such a way that you provide them the services which they were used to receiving when they were purely a domestic structure, right? And you may not have those capabilities, right? You may not be in Azerbaijan, and that's where your customer decides to go, right? So it becomes very tricky. How do you manage that? Do you set up alliances with local providers so that you can still provide the service to that global client, right? Or do you actually go and follow them, right? If you look at why companies actually go abroad, one of the major determinants is one of their customers actually going abroad. And they simply follow them, right? And that's how they expand, right? To some extent, it's a very safe form of expansion, right? Because you instantly have a customer. You know, when I used to work at McKinsey, here's another question I'll ask for you. Normally when you set up a new office, it is a satellite of an existing office. And if I've used this example in class, Bassem and whoever, don't give the example, or don't give the answer. Normally you set up a new office, it's a satellite of an existing office. Okay? Now when they set up the offices in Brazil for McKinsey & Company, what country do you think Brazil was a satellite of? Portugal. Portugal would make sense linguistically, right, historically, but it wasn't Portugal. What do you think? Who else might it be? Any thoughts? Sorry, what? Paraguay? No, it wasn't Paraguay. It wasn't Argentina either. I think the Brazilians wouldn't accept that. It wasn't anybody from Latin America. Could be Miami. Okay, you would think the U.S., the Latin connection, and McKinsey is from the U.S., but it was actually Germany, right? And why was it Germany? Is because who was investing in the 1960s and 70s in Brazil? Volkswagen, Mercedes, major clients of the firm in Germany, and they were going and setting up major operations in Brazil. And as a result, they followed suit. They set up a small office, and then slowly, after another sort of 10, 12 years, it became large enough and had independent clients that it became its own office. But in the beginning, it was reporting back to Germany because that's where the clients were headquartered. Okay, so following your customers is an essential part of global business, but you have to make sure that you're actually able to do it. And it becomes more and more an issue. I mean, this was back in the 1960s and 70s, right? It wasn't as much a pressure cooker then because, let's say, the consulting industry in Brazil wasn't as developed at that time, and as a result, there was less competition. Today, there's going to be, if you don't provide that service, somebody else is going to. Okay? Sorry? The hotel industry. If you, I mean, in terms of following where your customers are going. Yeah, if you don't have, if you look at the patterns of where your primary clients are they, you know, if they're doing Beirut, Dubai, Abu Dhabi, and so forth, and you only have operations in one, and don't underestimate the power of loyalty programs, right? When people are choosing which flights to use. Am I going to take the BMI flight, or am I going to take the British Airways flight? I'm going to do Emirates, okay? Those things do come into play. So alliances is one, excuse me, is one way to try to alleviate the pressure of this, and simply foreign direct investment is the other, doing it yourself. Okay. Now, talked about a lot of the opportunities. Last one I sort of ended on was more of a challenge. Some of the other challenges of globalization. You know, increased competitive pressures, as I just said. If you don't service your clients on a global basis, somebody else will, right? The costs, you know, what are customers asking for? We're going to be asking for lower costs. That's the first thing customers do, particularly when you're talking about global account management. I did a project with some colleagues over at London Business School on global account management, and inevitably, the first thing customers are going to ask for when either you approach them or they approach you, right? And you say, well, look, we're serving you in 10 different countries. And they say, well, that's great. Let's combine all those sales. So we're not buying 100,000 in every country. Now we're buying 1 million units. 1 million units, we want a volume discount, right? That's the first thing that's going to come on the table, right? And to be honest, if you are dealing with global customers, just one word of advice, it's better for you to go to them than to wait for them to come to you. Okay? Even if you know that they're going to be asking you for a better price, it's better for you to approach them. Don't wait for them to come to you. Economies of scale. Okay? It becomes more important. Okay? Related to the issue beforehand. So you have to be able to compete, either through alliances to achieve economies of scale, or through, again, internal economies of scale, larger production. Going to the issue that was mentioned before, diversified needs. You know, we are not one standardized global economy today, right? There are still a lot of differences. If there were not differences, the topic I want to talk about, offshoring, would be irrelevant. Because offshoring is based on the fact that there are still differences across countries, and that you can leverage those, right? If they weren't, the issue wouldn't exist. Liability of foreignness, right? This basically says, as a foreign company, you're at the very start, you're at a disadvantage, right? You may have a great technology, but you don't know the local market, you don't have the distribution channels, you don't have the local market knowledge, you're starting at a disadvantage. So you have to be able to overcome that with something which will wow your customers enough to basically have them say, okay, they're not selling everywhere, so it's harder to find their product, but their product is so good, we're still going to buy it. Okay? Sorry? Yes, especially in certain countries. You know, I think oftentimes not enough attention is given to, I mean, there is a lot written on Guangxi and how you do business in China and so forth, but some of that, it does just take time, right? And, you know, trust is something which, I saw one quote that said, trust comes with experience, and experience comes with co-location. Okay, so you actually have to be there in order to develop that trust, because it doesn't just come through the internet. You know, if you ask companies, you know, who do you trust more, suppliers which are servicing you through the internet or suppliers which are servicing you in person, in most cases, it's hard to develop a trusting relationship with an email address, right? Now, they might be reliable and everything, but that trust aspect comes with the human contact. Culture clash, obviously, big issue. Can cause a lot of lost investments. A lot of mistakes can be made by underestimating the differences in cultures. There are certain products you can sort of push as standardized, and there are others which you really do have to accommodate. Institutional complexity. You know, you go abroad, you deal with new laws, new taxes, new exchange rates, new languages. It's a whole different ballgame. To be honest, I always tell my classes, what is the big difference between general management and international management? Like, why is international management thought of as a separate field, right? And the reality is, it's pretty much a continuum, right? But the big difference is, when you cross national borders, what changes dramatically? It's the institutional complexity, right? You know, you can go from Quebec to Ontario, and there is quite a big difference, particularly in Canada. But it's still not as big as when you go from Quebec to the United States, right? You have different laws. You have, well, between Quebec and Ontario, you do have different languages as well. But you have different currencies when you cross national borders. Sorry? Different cultures. I mean, and like I say, within a country, you can also have different cultures. But in most cases, when you cross national borders, that level of difference just increases dramatically. Okay? So institutional complexity should not be underestimated. And this is really what distinguishes international business from simply domestic business, right? Is all those complexities you need to deal with, including, as I said, foreign exchange exposures. Well, I'll get to the next one. Contagion effect. I talked about that already. You know, the fact that globalization is causing countries to be more harmonious with each other also means that when one collapses, the others can collapse much faster as well. Okay? The last two issues, the penultimate is actually probably my favorite topic, right? Country risk. Okay? Country risk is something which, you know, oftentimes we associate with revolution, civil war, radical government changes, and so forth. But it doesn't have to be that dramatic, right? Country risk is simply anything that countries, normally we tend to focus on the political aspect of it, anything that governments do which can affect the economics of companies and organizations, right? That can be simply changing a tax law, right? When the US had this huge stimulus package back in late 2008, well, actually 2009, right? They were going to spend more than $1 trillion on a stimulus package. There was one line in there which had a huge impact on companies operating in the US, which were not American. And it simply said, this money can only be spent on American firms. Okay? So if you're a Canadian firm, too bad. You couldn't take advantage of this. While your competitors might get in a stronger position because they could, if they were actually domestically domiciled. Okay? So it can be very small changes, things which you don't notice. You can also have countries which go from looking very secure in 1 year to a few years later looking very risky in terms of exposure. You take something that's been in the news quite a bit the last few weeks is Argentina decided to nationalize the YPF, which was the used to be the national oil company of Argentina until it was actually privatized in the mid-1990s. It was privatized and then eventually sold to Repsol of Spain in 1999. But there's been a lot of pressure along the way to basically renationalize it. And it started actually with a partial, I'd say, nationalization, in that they forced Repsol to demystify part of the ownership. So they were sort of forced to sell a minority to a local player 4 or 5 years ago. But then this past month, it was declared that the government would simply be expropriating the 51% which Repsol owns. Okay? And you look at Argentina in the 1990s, it was probably one of the most open markets in the world. You could take money in, you could take money out. There were very few restrictions on investments. Okay? And today, it's flipped completely. You know, some people are saying it may be replacing Chavez as the sort of extreme sort of economic sort of model in South America. So you have to be careful. I mean, many of the investments companies make are not for 1, 2, 3 years. They can have a 10, 15, 20-year lifespan. Think about the mining industry. This is an industry which Argentina is actually trying to foster because it's, you know, if you think about Chile, Chile is a very large mining country, right? It's the same mountains that border Argentina, but Argentina hasn't been a large mining country for actually legislative issues. It's been restricted on what could be done in terms of mining. So the mining, the ore is there, right? And now they've decided they want to basically get investments to extract it. But with these type of policies, unfortunately, I don't think it will encourage those kind of investments, because for a mining investment, what do you need? You need a time horizon of probably 15, 20 years to actually have it turn around and actually be operating. Okay? So country risk, huge issue. I always tell people, don't underestimate this. If you're going to countries you think are safe, I mean, think about, you know, what countries was the IMF basically concerned about, even up to 5 years ago? What was most of their exposure was where? Where do you think? The IMF, which basically, you know, extends loans to countries in need because of financial issues. 5 years ago, most of their exposure was South America, Asia, some into Central Asia, a little bit into Africa. Okay? Basically zero into Europe. Right? Today, it's completely the opposite. South America, zero, basically. Brazil, Argentina, completely paid off the IMF so that they don't have to pay attention to them. And more than half the exposure is now in Europe. Okay? So, and that was a very quick turnaround, 5 years. Okay? So, oh, sorry, the International Monetary Fund. Okay, so it's basically part of the World Bank group. Essentially, you have the World Bank which does you know, development lending, and the IMF is really much more to central banks and to countries which are on the verge of default, effectively.
So there would always be a risk.
There's always a potential risk. Now, the question is, you have to think about what is your time horizon as an investor, okay? There are some people who look at this very opportunistically. I have the opportunity to go in, make some money, get out. I don't say that's always the best idea, okay? But you can also try, I mean, I don't want to get into it, but there are lots of ways to try to hedge your country risk. Due to, like one thing, even with this nationalization of YPF, I will bet you anything that that the government will still be paying its bank loans. Okay? It's amazing that you look at entities which have been nationalized in the past, they still pay off the bank loans, right? So one opportunity actually is, if you are going to go into a country and you want to reduce your risk, go in with a very high level of leverage, right? Because countries, what do they not want to do? They don't want to get frozen out of international financial markets. And if you default on bank loans, you will get frozen out much faster than if you simply expropriate one company's property. Okay, so oftentimes in risky countries, going in with high leverage, if it's possible, is one way to sort of mediate that risk. Okay? And finally, managing across borders. Okay? How am I doing on time? I have a tendency to keep going. Yeah? We're half an hour more? Okay, great. So I'm going to pick up the pace of it. Finally, managing cross-border. Just the challenges of dealing with international workforces, of actually managing subsidiaries in foreign markets. Okay? Now, what's at the center of much of this globalization or interdependence across countries? Well, it's multinationals, multinational corporations, or MNCs, as we call them. Right? Now, these are just some stats from the United Nations. Just to give you an idea, the way they classify is basically any company which has operations in more than one country gets classified as a multinational. Right? And according to that very basic definition, there are roughly 80,000 in the world. Okay? They have 800,000 affiliates, so basically on average they have around 10 foreign subsidiaries. Right? And they employ about 80 million people abroad, roughly the same number at home. Okay? So we're talking about 150, 160 million people employed by these multinationals. Now that might sound like a lot, but then when you think about what percentage of the world population is that, it's only 2 to 3%. Right? And yet these companies account for roughly 1/3 of world GDP and trade. So disproportionately, these organizations have a huge impact on what happens in the world. Right? Now, that's a neutral interpretation. For good or for bad, it's just a fact. That's what happens. Now, they have huge stocks. These are just some additional numbers. About $15 trillion in foreign assets, okay, depreciated foreign assets. And every year, they're investing roughly 1/10 of that. So $1 to $2 trillion abroad. And as we see, a lot of countries try to go after that money, right? Try to attract foreign investment, okay? What you have to be careful with is you don't pay more than you're going to get as a country. And oftentimes you see countries throwing hundreds of millions of dollars in breaks and ends up with tens of millions of dollars in investment and job creation. Okay? So it needs to be balanced, but sometimes you will get into bidding wars. I mean, you take a Canadian company, Bombardier, right? Bombardier, they were, when they decided that they were going to go ahead with the C-Series plane, they were basically looking at Wichita in the U.S., Mirabel in Quebec, and Belfast in Northern Ireland. And what do? Well, you simply play them off each other, and that's what they did, and countries fall into that trap, right? Well, they're giving me a better deal on union wages, well, they're giving me a better deal on deferred taxes and so forth, and then they end up with something which works for them, but maybe isn't as beneficial for any one country. Okay. Now, how did we get to this state today where, we talk about globalization as this sort of treadmill which we can't really get off, right? Well, has anybody read a book called World 3.0 by any chance? Okay, it's a book written by a Harvard professor named Pankaj Ghemawat, very good international business academic. And this book came out last year, and essentially what he tries to look at is really how global are we today? And he starts off by giving us a little bit of a history, classifies it, with today's terminology, everything's a 0.0, whatever, 1.0, 2.0, etc. And says, in the beginning, we basically had a world 0.0, right, which was basically tribal in nature. Not to say that there didn't exist nation states, but that individuals' natural affiliations tended to be more at the local level. So yes, the United Kingdom did exist, France existed, Lebanon existed, Egypt existed as nation states, but the primarily affiliation where people interacted tended to be at the local level. Okay? Again, a broad generalization, but one which I think is relatively, has a high degree of accuracy. Starting sort of in the 1600s, there did tend to be much more of a movement towards the nation state, right? And that lasted really, I think, up until World War II as the primary level of organization, right? And the primary level of institutional development, right? And then post-World War II is when we sort of see, if we think of the rise of the tribe was replaced by the rise of the nation state, what do we see post-World War II? Sort of the rise of the market. And I think this is what we tend to correlate with globalization and the increasing role of the global marketplace even over the power of nation states, right? There was a book written in the 1960s called Sovereignty at Bay, which basically was focusing on how powerful these multinationals were. At the time, most of them were American simply because Europe had been decimated by World War II, and a lot of the American firms were taking advantage of the global opportunities out there, which were being pushed by things such as the GATT, the General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs, the United Nations, and so forth. Basically, international institutions which are trying to push open the markets. Okay? So if we think about the last sort of 60 years as being the rise of the market, right, the challenge we have is nation states are still around, and they're really probably not going anywhere, right? And if we think about, are we actually in a place where the market rules everything? What do you think? No. I mean, if you think about institutions today, what would be the level of institution that would be appropriate for this? If we think about, here we have national governments, right? And it matched the level of sort of focus, which was the nation state. Here, if we think about the rise of the market, what would we need? We would need international institutions to regulate basically cross-border activities. Now, we do have some of those, and there are some pressures to try to increase their power, but the reality is they are considerably weaker than national governments, right? The power of the United Nations, as we've seen in many situations, is negligible compared to the power of nation states, right? The power of international trade agreements, they get broken all the time. International investment agreements, okay? So we still are, to some extent, the challenge we face today is we have globalizing pressures at the market level, but we're still dominated by national level institutions, right? Which is why in this book, he talks about, are we actually at a state called World 3.0, which is actually a semi-global world, right? In which we're not at this pure market liberalized economy. We are in a state of semi-globalization where, and I think if you look at the last 10 years, you see the role of nation states increasing even more. I'd say the 1990s, you saw, whether it was because of the fall of the Soviet Union or the collapse of dictatorships in South America, but you saw a huge movement towards market liberalization in many countries of the world. And today that actually is reversing, okay? And we're going in a different direction where there is much more protectionism, there is much more role of national governments in economics, okay? So I actually have to agree with Gemawat when he says we probably are more in a semi-global world than a purely global environment, okay? Now, and what this does is also raise some questions of really how global are we today? And this is where I'm going to ask a few questions. And I'm going to, Joe's seen this presentation before, so I'm going to ask him not to reply. I've got a few questions for you. What is the percent of snail mail, so paper mail, which crosses national borders? What do you think? No, a percentage of all mail, what percentage crosses national borders? What do you think? 20%. 20%. Any other guess? 5, 1, 1. Okay. Think about, I mean, particularly in Canada, half of the mail I get in my mailbox is junk advertisements, right? That's local mail. It's not coming from the US, it's not coming from Europe, okay? 99% of mail is local, okay? Now, let's think about phone calls. We're always on our cell phones, right? What percentage of calls are international? 5, 10, 10, 2, 5, 4, 0, 2. The reality is the majority of calls are, you're calling home, you're calling your office, etc. They are still local. So again, 98. Sorry?
Does that include Skype?
No, I think this is probably cell phones or landlines. So okay, but even if you add Skype in, maybe we get to most 3. Yeah. So, and again, these numbers will change, right? They will increase, but just to show you how much they have to increase to get to a position where they're actually the majority, right? I mean, so effectively 98% are still local. Internet traffic. 3, yeah, 1, 2, 3. 3 is the next number, right? It's actually a little bit higher, but again, 17. Okay, so there is quite a bit of internet traffic which is cross borders, but still 83% is local, okay, within the country where it's domiciled. Go through these a little faster. News coverage. So they took, I'm not exactly sure how they calculated this, but it's basically all news programs and newspapers, and looked at what percentage of news articles actually deal with international events. 5. Right? There's a lot of local newspapers, local magazines, things which are purely local. So basically what these numbers are telling us is we sometimes have a tendency to jump to conclusions, right? And we forget the fact that, you know, our barber is local, our dry cleaners are local, much of the things we do are purely local, okay? Again, a few more interesting numbers. I'll skip this one. That was 15%. Percentage of university students. So percentage of university students around the world which are from foreign countries. At McGill, it's, I'll give you a clue. It's 20%, and it's the highest in Canada. So, sorry? Oh, virtual? Well, I think it's basically, it must, because it's basically, it's based on passports of registered students. Yes. 2. Yeah. Most students are local. Okay. Percentage, first generation immigrants. So what percentage of the population does not live in the country that they were born in? Less than 1? Now I've got you guys all underestimating, right? Going low. It's actually 3%. Okay? But it's still, even though, like you say, Montreal, it's around 40%. Toronto, it's 55%. But the reality is, you go to most cities in China, it's probably 99.5%. Or you go to most cities in India, it's the same. Right? So we sometimes get swayed by extreme examples. And I'm just going to jump through these next ones. Exports, 23%. Okay? So we're getting a little bit higher now as we go down the list. Foreign direct investment as a percentage of overall investment, 16. Good guesses. And then finally, well, percentage of stocks owned by foreigners. So how integrated are the stock markets? 30? 20. Reasonable amount. This will also include foreign funds and foreign pension funds and so forth. This is going to relate to the issue I want to talk about with regards to offshoring. 20%. So again, it's not negligible by any means. It's an important segment, but it isn't the majority. And finally, this is an issue which got Europe in a bit of trouble lately. Cross-border ownership of government debt. So basically, how much of government debt is owned by foreigners, which means foreign banks, foreign individuals, and so forth. It's not, again, this is overall, certain countries, it's almost all domestic. You go to Japan and so forth, and it's pretty much domestic debt. So that does balance it out. There is a wide variance. But overall, 35%, which is the highest of all these numbers. And unfortunately, for the euro, you know, they probably wish this was a bit lower, because this has sort of contributed to some of that contagion effect. But basically, again, what these numbers highlight is that sometimes we do have a tendency to overestimate the role of globalization. Now, I also don't want you to think that it's the complete other extreme, right? Because the fact that, let's say there's, you know, trade is only 15, let's say, where's the trade? 23%, right? Exports as percent of GDP. You can be a small producer in a small country, and even if you aren't exporting your product, you are still impacted by the fact that there are exports available, and that conditionalizes what price you can charge, right? So these factors, you don't necessarily need to have 80, 90, 100% to be impacted by globalization, right? Just the fact that they're present is enough to affect your prices, affect what customers demand of you, and so forth, okay? So, again, I just want to sort of make us not overestimate the impact of globalization, but at the same time realize that it does impact us in secondary ways. So what does, let's say, being worldly mean? And this is a different term. I'm pirating this from one of my colleagues, Henry Minsberg, at McGill, who likes to use the word worldly much more than global, which I think is, they're actually two very different things. Worldly is, do you have an approach which allows you to recognize differences and take advantage of those, leverage them, okay, in what might be a globalizing world? So markets are opening, but yet there still are differences. And if you're worldly, you can understand when you should actually adhere to those differences and when you should actually push against them. Okay? So what does it mean to be worldly in a semi-global world? As I said, differences still matter. Many of those figures, as we saw, it's not a global, purely global environment. Management needs to appreciate these differences, go below the surface, move away from what we call ethnocentric managerial. What we do at home, we're going to do the same thing abroad as we do at home. That's what we call sort of ethnocentric approaches. Right? Now, in certain situations, you do want to do that, but you want to make sure that you aren't putting the blinders up to understanding when in certain situations you need to actually adapt. And lastly, more time needs to be spent on leveraging these differences rather than just focusing or forcing a homogenization. Right? Because it's these differences which actually allow you to actually leverage opportunities in different markets. Okay? And that basically leads me to my last issue, which I just have a few slides on. And give me the 5-minute, whenever, which might be now, I think. Leads to the issue of offshoring. Right? Now, offshoring, what am I referring to? Because it's actually a term which can be interpreted in different ways. Some people, when I say offshoring, think I'm talking about oil exploration off the coast. Right? Other people think I'm talking about offshoring of funds, financial transactions. What I'm referring to specifically is moving firm production, services, or knowledge functions to a foreign country. Right? So basically, you're moving production or certain activities to another market. Now, what you have to be careful of, offshoring and outsourcing are not the same thing. Offshoring is you're still doing it within yourself as a firm. You're not changing the boundaries of the firm. Outsourcing is transferring production, service, or knowledge activities to a supplier outside the firm. Now, you can outsource within your home country, right? And that's not offshoring, right? Or you can outsource and offshore at the same time. So basically, we call outsourced offshoring, where you basically go from doing your IT yourself in the United States to giving it to Wipro in India to do for you. Okay, that's outsourced offshoring. I'm going to talk specifically just about the offshoring part, so moving the production abroad, whether or not you do it yourself or somebody else. But actually, the example we focus on is keeping it in-house, but simply doing it in a different country. Okay. Now, there's been a lot of research focusing on why organizations offshore, how they choose which countries they're going to go to. Okay? So why we do it, obviously, leveraging labor cost savings. This is the driving force in almost all situations, looking for lower costs. Right? Accessing a talent pool. Okay? You may not have the talent you're looking for in the numbers you're looking for. You know, a lot of movement to India, yes, is based on cost, but it's also based on finding engineers which possibly you can't find at home, or the combination of the two, engineers at a reasonable price. Right? Now, we have to be careful because, as I'll talk about later, those prices can change. You go to Bangalore today, and it's not so cheap as it was 10 years ago to hire qualified labor. Okay? So what are we seeing? We're seeing now people going to secondary cities, third cities, looking for resources, for talent, which now in the big cities is as expensive as in other markets. Okay? Avoiding tariff barriers and additional costs. Okay? So you may decide, you know, we're selling to this country and they've increased these huge tariff barriers. We still want to sell to them, so we're going to go produce there locally and sell locally to avoid the tariff barriers. Now, the challenge I think that a lot of countries sometimes think is that, well, if I put a tariff barrier, they will come. Right? They'll come to produce locally. Certain countries can get away with that. If you're Brazil, right? If you are China, if you are India, you probably have the power to do that. If you are Chile, Argentina, Bolivia, you're not necessarily in the position where if you raise the tariffs, they're still going to come and produce inside. They may simply say, we're going someplace else, right? And that's happened, right? Increasing flexibility. You may decide we want to have production in multiple locations to increase our flexibility, whether it's on not having all our eggs in one basket. You know, if something happens to our facility in one country, you know, if you think about Repsol, if they only had YPF in Argentina and they've lost it now, the whole company would be gone, right? Or simply you want to increase time zone flexibility. You know, some of the first offshoring and services were call centers, right? And what was it based on? It was moving to time zones where you don't necessarily have to pay people overtime because it's during the daytime there, but yet you're servicing a nighttime environment, whether it's back in the US or in Europe or wherever it is, okay? Escaping domestic restrictions. Some companies will avoid rules, regulations which restrict their activities at home, but they're not restricted in foreign markets. Okay. And lastly, experimenting with different organizational approaches. Sometimes it's very hard to change at home. I mean, BMW, when they did their first major international expansion, it was actually in South Carolina. They had done some assembly facilities abroad before, but actually producing the cars, the first big facility was in South Carolina in the 1990s. And what did they do? They wanted to also experiment with different ways of management. So what did they hired basically top personnel from Honda US and Toyota US to see if they can adopt sort of more what we call sort of the Japanese lean production techniques in their facility in the US, and then eventually take those techniques and have them see if they could work in Germany. But it was easier to test them out in the US, given labor laws, than it was to test them out in Germany. Okay. Just a couple more slides. And again, locations, I'll skip quickly through this. You know, why do we choose India versus China, et cetera, et cetera? Costs, where are the skills, what is government and the business environment like, right? You should be very careful if you do decide to go for offshoring, don't just look at costs. Right? Don't just look at labor costs. Particularly if labor cost is only 5 or 10% of your overall production costs, do you really want to move your production all the way there for possibly a 1% savings in overall costs, but with the risk that this country may increase taxes, that it might be unstable in the longer term? Okay. So some potential challenges for offshoring. One is the rising costs in offshore markets. You look at labor inflation last year between the US, China, and Brazil. And this is real labor inflation, right? 3% US, 19% China, 21% Brazil. Okay? So yes, I mean, China, it might be very cheap, right? But 19% for 10 years or 5 years, it's going to get to a position where maybe it isn't as relatively cheap as you think it is. Which is why we're seeing some offshoring moving from China to Vietnam to Laos to Cambodia, et cetera. Okay? So don't just look at the static picture. You have to think about how that picture is going to evolve over time. Right? Currency fluctuations. Again, currencies can change dramatically. What happens if the Chinese yuan is appreciated? Okay? It can have a dramatic impact on the offshoring facilities of companies. Competition for workers, increased turnover. Well, as I said, it's tough to get engineers in Bangalore today. You have to compete for them. You have to pay more. You have to train them, so there are additional costs. There are consistency quality issues that you have to deal with, right? Inventory. This was an interesting case. We have one professor at McGill who, he's the vice chairman of a company called Peerless Clothing, which is one of the largest sort of producers of men's formal wear in the world. He gave the example in class one day of how much inventory they actually have floating from China to North America, because their primary market is still North America. And it's something on the order of several $100 million in men's suits just floating in the ocean, right? Now, that's an actual cost, right? Because of the time it takes to ship them from China to the primary market in the US versus simply producing them in Canada and almost express sending them across the border to the US, you have a maybe 1 month carrying cost of several $100 million of inventory. right? So it may not be negligible. You have to think about that. So transportation costs, tariffs, all these issues I talked about before, country risk, you have to think about them in 5 minutes. Okay. Think about them in choosing a location and whether it's actually the right decision for you or not. Okay. So some issues to think about with regards to whether or not to outsource. First of all, what percentage is direct labor? Okay. If it's only 1 or 2%, again, the case of Swatch. When Swatch, which used to be called SMH, produced most of their components in Switzerland, right? And they basically came to the rule that labor costs in the production of this watch is only 10%. Now, will people pay 10% more for the made in Switzerland name? And they thought yes, because if you produce too much of the components abroad, you can't put made in Switzerland on the actual watch. So in that situation, if you could get labor costs down to a small enough amount, it actually justified keeping them at home. And even in a country which had labor costs which were much higher than producing them in the East, if it was only 10%, it didn't matter. Even if your labor costs were 0 abroad, people would still pay that 10% and you could get your money back. Okay. You know, how important is the made in tag, obviously, as I just described. Logistics issues, okay. How long is the cost advantage going to last? Okay. Are we coordinated enough to arbitrage opportunities abroad? Okay. One great potential with offshoring is if you have operations in multiple countries, you can arbitrage depending on the currency changes, depending on where your market is and so forth. But you need that organizational flexibility to be able to move production from one location to another and so forth. If you don't have that flexibility in the system, you're not going to get the benefits. Okay? And finally, you know, the importance of economies of scale and not just labor costs. Would you be better off actually just producing one large facility at home, get those economies of scale, rather than having 4 or 5 facilities in lower cost countries? Okay. So, given I have, I think, 1 minute or probably less than that, I'm just going to focus on the last issue, which is actually the issue I'm sort of doing my research on specifically in this area, which is how does the organizational design of offshoring evolve over time? Okay? I'm not going to go through the last chart, which has a bunch of hypotheses and so forth, but just describe to you the example that we're looking at, which is MCKC, or stands for McKinsey Knowledge Center in India. And essentially, this was a center which was initially started in the late 1990s to service just very basic data requirements. Basically, overspills of information needs from the different offices across the globe. Okay? And why did they start it off? Basically, pure costs, right? And to alleviate some of the demand which local offices couldn't provide. Because traditionally in McKinsey, how it works is you have a local office and you have a local, let's say, library staff, which will provide all the knowledge, the basic data that consultants need to do their analysis. And what MCKC was doing was, we're going to centralize some of those operations into a location where it's actually cheaper to get that data. Okay? Now, in the very beginning, that's all it was. It was document production and very basic data. You know, how large is the United States? You know, how large is this market? And so forth. Now, what the leaders of MCKC did, and the issue we focus on here is, how do the capabilities of your offshore entity actually co-evolve with organizational change within the organization, right? And what we saw is, started by initiatives by the leaders of MCKC, what did they do? They overperformed at these basic issues in order to gain legitimacy within the organization. Okay? Once you gain that legitimacy, you can then go and basically try to provide higher order services, okay, which they did. And so then they started to provide more analysis. Okay? Then what happened? They started actually to provide new value to the organization. And how did they do this? They said, we're going to actually be the source of, or let's say the repository of all the data within the firm. So whereas before it was spread across all the different offices, they said, we're going to bring it all together, and then everybody will have access to it. So as opposed to just replacing a function, now they're actually contributing something new. They're bringing all the data within the firm together, right? Centralizing it in India. Okay? This wasn't the original objective of the offshore entity. So slowly they're moving to higher value operations. Now what happened? when they started to do that, they actually came on the radar screen of what within the firm are very powerful entities, which are the functional and industry practices. And they said, well, you're doing things which we're interested in, and we actually focus on. We're the specialists in finance, we're the specialists in pharma, and so forth. And so what happened in the end is that actually the practices started taking ownership of certain aspects of MCKC. So everything that's done in finance now reports to the head of the financial practice. Everything that's done in pharma goes to the pharma practice. So what we see in this case was the offshore entity actually increased its value added progressively, right? And increased its importance. But actually, at the end of the day, it actually reduced its autonomy, reduced its individual power, because now it was actually being controlled by the practice and industry operations. But it actually became a much more vital part of the firm and really changed the way the whole firm was organized. Okay? So it's a very quick 2-minute description of the case, but it's something which hopefully we'll be publishing in the near future. You can read it in greater depth. But sorry for going over. I think that's something characteristic of professors. But thank you very much for your attention. It's really been a pleasure to be here. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Toulan, for the engaging talk. I'd like to thank you all for coming here tonight. If you'd like to know more about our McGill Alumni Association in Lebanon, all you need to do is to go on Google and type AOC McGill Lebanon, and you'll get to our website. In the meantime, please stay and enjoy our cocktail reception, and I hope to see you all in the near future. Thank you.